Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here in this sunny afternoon in the spring in Minneapolis. I am Valeria Piccoli. I'm the chair of the Arts of the Americas and Canon Linda Cutler Curator of Latin American Art here at MIA. And I had the pleasure of stewarding this project here at MIA. It is an exhibition that was presented first at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and it's opening, or actually it opened yesterday here at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And I had the pleasure, as I told you, to steward this. This project kind of initiated when my colleague Jill Albert-Yohe was here, was the curator of Native American art, and I saw her around. So I wanted to to thank Jill for being here and for bringing this project to the museum. And today we have the honor of having here Philip Deloria, who is a professor at Harvard University, and where his research and teaching focus on the social, cultural, and political histories of the relations among American Indian peoples and the United States, as well as the comparative and connective histories of indigenous peoples in a global context. He is the author of Becoming Mary Sully, Toward an American Indian Abstract, that was published in 2019. Phil Deloria is also like the great nephew of the artist, and he will talk this afternoon about her life and her work, so we can all be introduced to Mary Sully's artistic production here today. So, please join me in welcoming Professor Philip Deloria to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Valeria, for the introduction and for stewarding the exhibition. Jill, of course, I know you're out there somewhere. Thank you for always being an advocate for Mary Sully. From the very first time that one of the very first talks I ever gave on Mary Sully, Jill was in the audience, and we've been corresponding about Mary Sully's work ever since. So I am so pleased to be able to talk to you here today about the work of Mary Sully. She was my great aunt. An aspirational but unrecognized Dakota artist who, when she died in 1963, never would have imagined that her work was being discussed in some of the greatest museums in the United States, or hanging on the wall in single artist shows at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Minneapolis Institute of Art, being lauded by Holland Cotter of the New York Times. This was a sort of an amazing moment for all of us. Just last week, 3 of her works were part of a show, Reverberations, at the Ford Foundation Gallery in New York. It's about sort of BIPOC design work, and it's a fabulous show if you happen to see or find yourself there. And today then we get to celebrate the opening of a new iteration of Mary Sully Native Modern here in Minneapolis. So Mary Sully is having a moment that's quite extraordinary. There have been a few preludes to this moment, and I think it's just worth pausing on them a little bit, including works appearing in a show at the St. Louis Art Museum, and more to the point, the fabulous show Hearts of Our People, curated here at MIA, and traveling, sadly, from the summer of 2019 through 21, so right in the heart of the COVID pandemic. But it is the case that this institution, Minneapolis, and Jill in particular, sits at the very heart of the story of Mary Sully, and for that I am very grateful. During her life, however, her art was shown, as best as I can tell, only 3 times. 2 of these seem to have been day-long exhibitions at Indian schools, Pipestone in Minnesota and Flandreau in South Dakota. When she died in 1963, her artwork and a few random items passed to her sister, Ella Deloria. And when Ella died in 1971, these things passed to my grandfather, Vine Deloria Sr., who tried to figure out what to do with it all. And there was a lot of all, because Ella had enjoyed a challenging but incredibly productive career as a Dakota ethnographer and linguist, and she left behind books and manuscripts and basically a lot of paper. My grandfather sent much of this to the University of South Dakota, where it would become part of the Ella Deloria Project archive. Mary Sully's art, however, he sent to our family in Colorado. My mom and I both found the work simultaneously mystifying and compelling. This was before you could pull out a laptop and Google people's names. My father was less interested, in fact, if not even mildly hostile to the entire project. And so my mother squirreled the art away for some 30 years. When my father passed in 2005, she pulled it out again. And it created these really interesting kinds of, for me as a historian, these really interesting memory challenges, because I remembered it being in a gray box, but my mom said, no, it was a kind of mottled box. And then I remembered it being transferred to a suitcase and pulling it out in 2006 from a suitcase. And she said, no, it was always in a box. And then I remembered it being stored in the basement underneath the stairs. And she said, no, it's always been in a box under the bed. So I feel like I'm willing to grant her all of her memories of the 70s, but like the 2000 and aughts, I feel like I probably am remembering stuff. But it's been a really interesting kind of set of conversations actually with my mom about sort of how this work was actually held on to. When I first realized the genius of Sully's work, and it took me a long time to sort of, well, not a long time, it took me a while to sort of get there, I approached my curator friends who reminded me that they get many calls out of the blue from people who have discovered the artwork of a relative in the basement or under the bed. And they think that that artwork belongs on the walls of a museum. And so they challenged me to prove the importance of the art, which I tried to do through this book, Becoming Mary Sully Toward an American Indian Abstract. I gave a series of experimental talks, refining my argument over time, and listening for other interpretive voices. I did have to try to retool myself as an art historian, but much of this book is also a community project, a collective project of knowledge and wisdom. For example, I make an argument about synesthesia, which would not probably have come to me, but for a young man in Omaha who said, I look at this art and I see the world in this particular way. I can resonate with this, and I have this thing called synesthesia where my perceptual, sort of circuits are crossing, and you should think more about that. And I did. And it happened very early on, actually, this where I didn't actually get his name. Later on, I stopped making that mistake, and when people said interesting things, I was frantically scrawling things down. So it is a community and collaborative sort of process. Well, you're probably wondering, what was this mysterious art all about? This was the major form of what she did, what she called the personality prints. There were 134 of them. As far as I can date them, which is hard, between the late 20s and the mid 1940s. At some point, she stopped making these. It's not quite clear exactly when. They're triptychs, 3-part works. They're stacked vertically, as you can see here. And her media were very simple: colored pencil for the most part, black ink, a little bit of white paint. Later in some of the works, she got a hold of some of this beautiful gold paint and some sort of silver paint that she started using. So the works grew in sophistication and intensity over time, each one representing the personality of a person or sometimes an idea. So here's a man named Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was a radio preacher, a kind of modernist preacher. And when you know that, you can see this little horn of a radio kind of speaker, and you can see notes coming out, and maybe those notes turn into an audience. And so these are the ways that the work actually functions. Sometimes in the course of this talk, I'm going to shift the way that they appear on the screen just so we can get more. You can see more and perhaps more detail. So when you see it like this, you can see the ways that the work has been sort of shifted around a little bit. So the personality prints were the bulk of her work, and I will spend most of my time today talking about those pieces. But she also worked in 2 other genres, and my own more recent thinking, sort of post-book, has pointed to the ways that these interacted with one another. The first of these is a series of ethnographic illustrations that she created for her sister, starting in the late 1930s and continuing into the 40s and 50s. And then the second, a series of dramatic illustrations also created for her sister, who hoped to publish a book of Dakota legends. And you can see sort of some examples of that. So my plan then for today is, first of all, to offer a bit of historical context, to break out the distinct qualities of each panel or position in the triptych. They sort of function in formal ways. It's important, I think, to talk about. Introduce a few comparisons and connections to plains, Great Lakes, woodlands kinds of aesthetic traditions, and then to contextualize the multiple artistic influences that really structured her thinking and her work, including that of American modernism, which I think is a really important dimension here. So Susan Deloria, her birth name, Mary Sully, was born in Wapala, South Dakota, on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. Her father, my namesake, was the Episcopalian minister in charge of the reservation's missions. He was headquartered at the St. Elizabeth's Mission, which had a surprisingly rigorous and often tolerant mission school, which the young Susan Deloria attended. She then went to the All Saints School in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, but didn't quite thrive there. The academic context was really not one that was friendly to her, and she finished and spent much of her time afterwards at home. By the 1920s, however, she had joined her sister Ella in Lawrence, Kansas, where Ella taught girls health and physical education at the Haskell Indian School. She'd also started writing pageants, Ella had. And Susie, who was in the process of shifting her name, you can see here she's identified as Mary, she worked alongside Ella, developing costumes and designs. She attended courses sporadically at the University of Kansas. We'll see a little Kansas reference here in a minute. And among other things, conceived of a possible future for herself as an art teacher, or maybe as an artist or designer. Sometime in the late 1920s, she seems to have fixed on this pattern of 3 linked images. These first ones, there are 8, I think, are recognizable in 2 ways. First, she identified her subjects only by their last names. She stopped doing that after these first 8. And she uses, stylistically, she uses a limited color palette, leaves a great deal of empty or negative space. All of these things would change as she developed her style over time. More color, more depth, more texture spread fully across the paper. In some of the late works, you can see she's really working the colored pencils quite hard, trying to get, a deep, rich color, trying to get texture out of it. So, and I'll also sort of call out some of the things which are on the wall in the gallery, and in this case, Steinmetz, which, and the conservation here is really, really beautiful. The image just really pops, and it's beautiful. It's really beautiful, especially this bottom panel, which sort of just really took my breath away seeing it on the wall. It really looks fantastic. So if we think about the top panels then, she's operating in this really interesting space, which is something about abstraction, something about symbolism, something about representation. It's kind of straddling the line and moving back and forth, right, among those things. And the motto, here, the aphorism is, the more you know about the person, the deeper these images get, and the more they become representational, and the less they are abstract. So for example, down in this bottom corner, Alison Skipworth, just knowing her name, we see that she's punning on a skipped rock across this pond to the stardom that waits at the other end. Alison Skipworth was an actress. Or at the other side, Helen Wills, who was a tennis player, and once we know that she was a tennis player, we can see that tennis net behind. We can see perhaps these sort of 5 sort of crowns that might represent the 5 Wimbledon championships that she owned, or perhaps this visor that she wore. So we can see these sort of icons and things that start to take shape. She had a deep interest in American popular culture. She lived with Ella periodically, or the 2 sisters lived together periodically in New York City, where they enjoyed movies, music, the radio, museums, popular magazines, newspapers, all of which influenced her choice of subject, celebrities, and her style. So in this image I just love, and I hope you're going to love it as much as I when you see her image for Florian Ziegfeld, because so often you can draw rather direct connections between the things she may have seen, that is to say elements of a visual vocabulary, and the works themselves. So here you can see this sort of like Florence Ziegfeld, like Busby Berkeley later on, loved to set up these sort of human spirals and sort of art with a camera lens kind of from above looking down and people moving around. And you can see exactly that same thing, that sort of thing happening. But, when you look at the bottom row, you can also see that she's riffing on the cartoons of the 1930s, right? Which a lot of times had these sort of little bald men with little, 2 or 3 little pieces of hair sticking up. And then in the middle panel, you can see she's taken the notion of stardom and these bald-headed men as an audience and sort of turned them into this beautiful and interesting, intricate kind of design pattern. And then if you look at the bottom image, you can see the bald men are still there, right? These little yellow circles with little bald hair. And now the star has become this thing that actually has some movement and some motion in it, right? Much like the ways that sort of these collections of chorus girls would move around and then form these sort of human kinds of things. So the more you look at the art, the more you know about it, the more you start to see. And I'll just give you a couple other examples. This one also on the wall, both of these in the gallery. In this case, she's representing visually the contents of a magazine article that speaks at length about the struggles of two-ness, and how as a child, the writer was trying to blossom in two different environments. It was like, I couldn't bloom because I had to go from one place to the other. So you can see the resonances between this account and Sully's own life, perhaps as a bicultural person. So here you've got these kinds of things happening, but I also want to sort of point to the ways that those bottom panels oftentimes, and not just the bottoms, but oftentimes reflect various forms of native imagery, native making. So here we've got kind of an example of a possible bag, this sort of notion of the Capemni design, right, as above, so below, a kind of horizontal line, right, with a mirroring thing that happens, and also a vertical line with a mirror that happens that way, right? So she does a number of these kinds of things. And I'll just sort of, oh, I have this little quote, right? So the point here really is to say that, like, she's not really directly sort of taking things off of beadwork patterns. She's riffing on them, right? She's sort of using them and building off of them in these different kinds of ways. So she's reworking, looking for affinities of composition and color rather than a sort of straightforward reproduction. So here's an earlier work, marks, I think, one of her first forays away from pencil and ink and towards the use of white paint. And of course, all my sort of dating here is tentative. There's no documents that she did about what she did in what order or anything like that. So I'm using mostly stylistic analysis to make suggestions about what may have happened when. So you can see here the formal affinities, again, based around compositional technique, the triangles and the diamonds, so characteristic of beadwork, the rows and squares, beadwork and quillwork, all of these things kind of working together here. And simply to offer one additional example and remind us of the ways that these top panels are evidence of her wit and her humor and her sort of funny ways about making visual sorts of puns. So here, a whole collection of little Kansas Jayhawks lift the winged feet of the track star Glenn Cunningham. You know, and sort of I just think it's fantastically interesting and fun, right? These little Jayhawks carting these sort of winged feet around. Notice like how beautiful this middle panel is, right? It's really, really stunning. And then you can see again the same sorts of patterns, right, that we've been thinking about in this bottom panel. Mirroring dualisms, right, up and down, left foot, right foot, symmetrical splits, horizontal, vertical, raw, cooked, all of these kinds of things. So in the middle panels then, as I think you've been able to see, she's aiming for design patterns, right? Industrial design patterns, wallpapers, textiles, things like that. These are often gridded. Sometimes you can see on the back where she's made a false start and she had like 2 or 3 horizontal grid lines and then oftentimes sort of diagonal lines that she would use to orient these patterns. It was a moment of opportunity for vernacular women designers to enter contests, and it was a moment of explosive creativity when it came to pattern. So these are the Americana prints, pretty well known from that period. They oftentimes got celebrities or other folks, but Women's Wear Daily and others would have open contests for women to submit designs. And so one way to think about Mary Sully's work is she was thinking along those different kinds of, along those kinds of lines. So this is, I think, this is one of my favorite pieces, and it's also in the gallery, and also one of the most amazing middle panels, because I think it reflects a moment when Sully seems to also have seen beyond these panels as being simple industrial design patterns and began really taking them as artistic works. Right? They are so interesting, I think, and so complicated, so beautiful, that they might actually defy an effort to turn them into a textile or a wallpaper or a linoleum or tile, anything like that. So for a long time, I struggled with this image to figure out what it was. It looked to me, this top panel is a sort of figure ground illusion, which she does a lot of, and I couldn't see past the sort of central figure being foregrounded. So it looked like a kind of trilobite, right, with these sort of 2 arms and these 2 pink eyes, and I just couldn't see that it actually is negative empty space until I figured out more about who Lawrence Tibbett was, and that Lawrence Tibbett had a little cottage in a place called Temescal Canyon outside of Los Angeles, and then there was a stage and an amphitheater, and as an opera singer, he would go out and stand on the stage and he would sing, and the notes would reverberate in the canyon, and suddenly I realized that that's a canyon, it's empty space, and these are notes reverberating, and these horizontal bands are actually sedimentary rocks, and it's Pacific Ocean behind it, and suddenly it becomes very representational of a kind of historical sort of moment. But if you look at the middle panel, what she's done is in each one of these little Easter eggs, she sort of flipped it around as if looking through a camera obscura, right? So the ocean is down at the bottom and the sedimentary rocks are at the top. So this is really interesting thing that's happened here. And then each one gets a kind of candy cane, which is also the form of a note, and you can see more notes. And suddenly it's about the sort of beauty of the music and sitting in the setting. And then you get to the bottom panel and it's like a single note just going exploding, right? So she's really trying to create the sort of sensation of hearing this, of being in this canon, hearing this different kind of music. It's also worth thinking about the ways that this image and many others point towards a somewhat different kind of northern aesthetic influence, that of the rotational symmetry of the circle, found in both quill work and beadwork, a lot of medallions, kind of use this. So Sully used rotational symmetry like this in each of her 3 different panels. But it often appears in these sort of kaleidoscopic designs in the bottoms and the middles. And you can see an example, Amelia Earhart, that's a top panel. Dr. Defoe, here the second from the right, is a middle panel, and then a couple of sort of bottom panels. So there's really interesting and lovely things here. And I also just have to thank Valeria for, I had looked at the Mia catalog and seen so many beautiful things, including this blanket. And I said, that blanket would be so great. And she said, I don't know that that's going to work. And then I came to the show yesterday and there it was. It's fantastic. It's such a great example. It's so beautiful to have them together. So along with all of this interest in popular culture and with this sort of native design sort of impulses, there's an anthropological sensibility that's happening here as well through this thing we can call culture and personality anthropology, which was a dominant thread of anthropology in the late 20s and 30s, sort of represented by Ruth Benedict in particular, but this sort of Franz Boas school of anthropologists. So her sister Ella was at Columbia working with Boas, with Benedict, and later on with Margaret Mead. All of these things are going on. So the Benedict idea of culture and personality, right, has to do with how culture sort of is defined and known through distinct kind of personalities and how people are shaped into personalities through their cultures. This really interesting kind of theoretical position. It's seems to me to be the case that Mary Sully may have been thinking along the very same lines, but starting in the late 20s, before she actually had access to Ruth Benedict's thinking. But it's pretty clear that by the 30s that there's a dialogue going on, I think, through Ella with this idea of culture and personality anthropology, which means that we need to pay close attention to the individuals. And it's part of an argument I've already been making, but just to give you a couple more examples, here's John Philip Sousa, and you can see the ways that his personality is coming out in this image. The sousaphone, sort of, 2 of these sousaphones, the notes are arranged as a marching band on a green field or a green backdrop, then converted into these other things, all in the colors of the University of Illinois, where Sousa spent a lot of time, right, as a sort of marching band sort of guy. Or this image, Malcolm Campbell, which is completely mystifying until you realize that Malcolm Campbell, or discover that Malcolm Campbell was a speed race driver who drove a super cool car called the Bluebird. And then you realize it's a Bluebird and it's a speed track and there's this sort of like colored circles of speed, and he wore these really distinctive driving goggles, and wow, all of a sudden it's very representational again. Or also in the gallery, Fred Astaire, which is one of many people think of this as one of their favorite works. So you can see the dancing feet up at the top. That dancing feet is converted into kind of this tile pattern, but each one of those sort of rosettes, those sort of things, is this whole set of feet moving really fast. And then those feet are then converted in the bottom panel in the same kind of way. So this rotational symmetry, follows, I think, other plains and woodland sorts of aesthetic in the ways that it implies circularity, but also oftentimes is sort of squared off in squares and rectangles. So circles and grids working together in combination. And this anthropological sort of context, I think, of culture and personality has to also include these ethnographic images she did, the partnership that she had between the partnership between the sisters with Ella, which took concrete form in a series of illustrations, many of which reflect Sully's own knowledge of plains and Great Lakes practices and forms. So Ella's ethnography, like her other book, her great book, Water Lily, was unpublished for many years. It was released with an edit only recently in 2023, and well worth looking at for folks interested, particularly in the kinship aspects of Dakota life and culture. So she's got this incredibly rich, I think, sort of knowledge and interest in the material culture of Lakota and Dakota people, Plains people. This is one of the illustrations that she does for the, and I think you can, if you just sort of look, you can see like, parfleche boxes and sort of, little, possible bags and a pipe bag and many, many things sort of hanging in this, a whole collection, right, of material culture, which took a lot of shape then in some of these sorts of drawings, which she did for her sister. So we can see this sort of war club, cradle board, pipe, cradle, pipe bag. And then one of my favorites, right, doll. And then here at Mia, this fabulously beautiful sort of doll kind of collection. So she's doing all of these different kinds of work. And the personality prints sometimes drew directly from this ethnographic work. So you can see the cape that she draws as an ethnographic illustration, which then takes shape in this image of Shirley Temple also on the wall in the gallery. And so she did this short series of things which included this ethnographic labeling herself, no longer just putting the name of the person, but actually doing, right, a sort of little ethnographic riff, right, on this. So she's actually bringing ethnography into the project itself. And just to show you two things, this isn't actually on display, but it's a beautiful example of these kinds of capes. But this is on display, and it's just a fabulously beautiful sort of example of great curation where you can look past this beautiful cape and you can actually see the Shirley Temple cape right there. And you're invited to a visual dialogue, right, between the works themselves, right, and some of the material culture, that is here. So just another couple of examples of this ethnographic impulse. Jane Withers, who is like Shirley Temple's pal, but where Shirley Temple is all cheery and chipper, and Jane Withers is a little bit less, and she's got these braids, and she's kind of roaming around, and so it's really focused on hair and braids and ornaments. This one is also in the gallery, and it's quite beautiful. So here she is again with these sort of ethnographic kinds of things going on. And just one more example of this, Billy Burke, who is if you will recall, Glinda, the good witch in The Wizard of Oz, floating in on that little shiny bubble thing into Munchkin Land, which is full of flowers. And so floral is actually going to be this really important kind of theme here. And you can see floral down below, the ethnographic label, right? And all of the different ways in which floral, as you're moving through the gallery, so much beautiful kind of floral work and floral imagery, right, to be seen here. So one of the questions that people might ask is like, okay, so her name was Susan Deloria. Why did she call herself Mary Sully? And so it's worth thinking about the sort of genealogy that's going on here. And the answer is that this guy, Thomas Sully, was her great-grandfather. For those of you sort of not familiar with Thomas Sully, he painted the sort of celebrities of sort of antebellum America, including the Andrew Jackson that you find on your $20 bill. That's a sort of Thomas Sully kind of image. He also painted the Queen Victoria here, which supposedly was Queen Victoria's favorite portrait of herself. As you can see, Thomas Sully was also quite a dashing guy, and apparently they got along quite well. So here's a sort of bit of a genealogical tree, that sort of tracks this family. So the sisters, these two sisters, speculated that artistic talent somehow flowed through families, right? That there was a sort of racial inheritance or genealogical kind of inheritance. Alfred Sully, Thomas Sully's son, was also an artist, though not as accomplished as his father. He was also a military officer. But the Sully name had this kind of marketing traction that I think was also the subject of serious speculation. So they're thinking a lot about what their connection might be to Thomas Sully. At the same time, they're thinking that Sully name, people might recognize that. So they got both those things going on there. So you've got that dimension. But you also have the place of her grandmother, right? Pehamdutuin, Red Crane Woman, which was of equal or perhaps even greater importance, right, in this story. And so I wanted to sort of walk through a little bit of that part, but I also want to pause here to sort of just mention genealogically. I put my dad and myself in the corner in a low sort of space just so you could sort of see who was what. But I want to stop for just a quick moment and to honor and recognize other members of my family, particularly my dad's generation. So my aunt, Barbara Deloria Sanchez, who we lost just this December, who's a fabulously interesting and wonderful person, dedicated teacher and educator. And then I want to honor my uncle, Philip Sam Deloria, who is here with us today, and my aunt, Vivian Arviso. So I'm just so glad that you're here. So I think there's something to be said about sort of like digging deeply into sort of how her Dakota sort of sensibilities also structured the project here. And I go back to this early letter. It's the only place where the personality prints actually have a different kind of name. She calls them the Luta personality prints, or seems to have called them that to this Byron Brophy. And when you think about this sort of like there's, you know, and I'm no expert in Dakota language, and I suspect there may be people out here who are, but there, you know, we've luta as a sort of particular form of red, a scarlet red, a kind of red that's used in names, that's used in honoring, as opposed to Shah, a kind of more everyday red, right? Maybe less bright, maybe less brilliant, right? So luta has a kind of a traction to it that's really worth thinking about, particularly in relation to the other ways in which variants, right, of this word appear. And I'm particularly taken by this sort of notion that like it's not just about the color, it's about what you do with the color. You know, using it to paint things red or scarlet, using it in terms of red quill work, these sorts of things, which all fits together in kind of a package of recognition and honoring that I think is part of this Dakota epistemological approach that she has. You can see it really clearly, I think, here, and this again is in the gallery with the image of for George Ade. And she's handwritten a caption underneath saying, you know, he's very generous in letting people share the grounds of his estate in Indiana. And what does she do to honor him? She creates a pair of red quilled moccasins for him, right? So I think there's this going on. She also does this, at least in a few other kinds of cases. So here's an example again of these moccasins. Another one of my really favorite images is that for Bobby Jones, golfer. Where this is a mysterious thing, but it looks like a golf head, but I also think it's, any golfers out there? I think, you remember back in the day, like golf clubs had these cool names like Mashie and Niblick and, you know, Fairway Wood and things like that. I think she's sort of setting up a kind of rangefinder, right? That, you know, you got your pitching wedge here, you got your Mashie there. So I think she's got this golf thing going on. And then she chooses, right, with Bobby Jones to honor him with a pair of moccasins. And these are, again, things that are, these moccasins here present, you know, in the gallery as well. So there's two ways then to think about this artistic skill, right? There's the sort of passing it through Thomas Sully, but then there's also this Dakota way, which has to do with sort of the figure of the double woman, which is a bit more spiritual, you know, perhaps almost mystical kind of root. The double woman skill is something that comes to you as a spiritual gift, right? It's not to say you don't practice and own and master your skill and your craft, but it comes to you from somewhere else. And Ella actually talked about this through some of her ethnography, talking about the two-woman ceremony, recognizing this really interesting position, right, of artistic talent, but also sort of danger, about being on the edges and the margins of the camp circle, right, but also being brought in and embraced even through your difference. So Ella actually at one point in the letter used the sort of idea of the two-woman or the double woman to describe herself. But I think it's safe to say, perhaps, if we were going down this road of Dakota epistemology, that they were both functioning. They were functioning in relation to each other, right, as sort of double women, doubles of themselves. They were outside their culture, but they were gifted observers. They were creators. They were preservers. They were outside of American culture as well, but they were also observers and ethnographers of that as well, right, of American culture. So what I think Mary Sully created was a kind of visual observation or visual ethnography of American life, right, in this doubling with one another in relation to cultural boundaries within themselves. They were, in this sort of sense, kind of quintessentially modern people, right? So there's an interesting kind of overlap, I think, between thinking about Dakota epistemological things and thinking about the ways we think about modernism and modernity. And so we ought to sort of, you know, marinate on that for a quick moment. So Annie Stein Annie Stein, interestingly, the only artist in the 134 images that make up this canon, right? There's plenty of opera singers, there's movie stars, there's only one artist, and it's Annie Stein, who is a completely obscure person, a local painter in New York City, operating somewhere between the talented amateur and kind of low-level professional sort of space. Um, uh, but I think it reflects kind of this sort of image, and others reflect the ways in which she can also be seen, Mary Sully can be seen to be embedded within the sort of modern art world of New York. I think of her a lot in relation to Charles Demuth, who did a series of these things he called poster portraits, which were sort of portraits of his friends. Here you can see just a couple of different ways in which Charles Demuth is trying to represent motion, stop time motion, right, as the fire truck gets closer and closer on the rainy night, and that becomes part of a William Carlos Williams poem. You can see, with Fred Astaire, these sort of, happy feet. You can see this kind of, in Henry Joy, this kind of Venetian blind figure ground illusion kind of going on. So all these things are happening at the same time. And here, this is just to sort of show you again, sort of some of the people that Demuth was representing. He was doing the kind of form of personality print himself. So there's a sort of shared project here with Demuth, with Marius de Zayas, and with others. It's not a project of the 1930s, though. It's one that actually goes back to the teens and the 20s. It's also just quickly noting that Mary Sully and Charles Demuth did two of the same people. So here's both of them doing Gertrude Stein. They also both did Eugene O'Neill. So there's a kind of cosmopolitanism here, right? I think it's a super complicated kind of visual and aesthetic vocabulary that oftentimes ends with this sort of Dakota twist. And here's, Annie Stein kind of thinking a bit more about what these kind of blanket strips with medallions, might have looked like. And in this sense, right, hearkening back, right, to older kinds of styles that come out of the native context. And that then brings us to thinking about the bottom panels, finally, at last. So I think there's a movement through the triptychs, from a complex sort of modernist image at the top to the sort of modern design in the middle, to something that would be then beyond modernism, right, in the bottom. A kind of hybrid set of forms that point to a Native American future that is both Indian, but also constantly engaged with the world. And I think the master key for thinking a bit about what those bottom panels looks like is this image, which is also to be found in the gallery, Indian History. I think it's the master key to the politics of the work that's going on here. And in these images, you can see references to, I think, Diego Rivera in the kind of mural form, particularly in this kind of thing where, Rivera has these sort of like what look like little barriers between scenes, but the scenes look like they're actually joining together. And this is the same kind of thing. It looks like this is all one scene, but when you look very closely at it, you can see that it's actually three scenes. It's different. And then I think, pointing to Aaron Douglas with these sort of modernist silhouetted figures of anxiety. So here she is, right, as a Native American artist drawing upon prominent African American and Mexican muralist kinds of traditions. A useful point of reference for this is the bottom strip, this sort of panel of idyllic native life, pre-contact and pre-conquest. And I'm going to come back around to this a little bit, but I just want to show you a few other sorts of examples of this kind of bottom panel being a kind of native futurist sort of look. So Cornelia Otis Skinner, who was a playwright who did sort of one-woman plays, famous women in history. This one is also in the gallery. It's a beautiful, fantastic kind of image, but you'll notice at the end, she ends with the parfleche kind of design. And you can see that here. This colors, this sort of four-color scheme, which is a part of these parfleche raw hide painting kinds of traditions, also visible in the Indian history kind of thing. And you can, just to sort of point it out again, you can see the ways that the visual dialogue that's being set up in the gallery here. You can see down in the lower corner there, some moccasins, the parfleche on the wall. You can see these other kinds of images, right? So when you're looking through the gallery, be attentive to the dialogue, I think, that has been really arranged in a really beautiful way here. Here's Babe Ruth, and you can see again the sort of figured ground slit pattern that's going on. And again, sort of like this is a native expression in these bottom panels, right? But it's also part of a more complicated sort of vocabulary. Alice Fazende, the last Confederate widow with a candle kind of burning in the window. You can see this beautiful pattern, which is also great. Got these sort of native sort of visual vocabularies going on. Lunton Fontaine, this is the sort of representation of the Lavender Marriage of a sort of very prominent theater couple. You can see the bottom panel, two parfleche boxes tied together, right, in this marriage. Oh, she's doing it in an ethnographic kind of sense, and she's drawing again on these sort of traditions, these native kinds of traditions for the visuality that's, that's going on here. And just to sort of do one last sort of move here, there's this really interesting moment where she starts doing things which are more illustrative, right? Visual representations like this. This is one of the ethnographic drawings she did for Ella, but she starts doing a few other examples of this. And this is this really interesting moment where she's moving away from sort of very traditional sort of plains women's practices of abstraction, geometrical abstraction, into more of a men's sort of practice of pictographic representation, right? Which you can see here. Barely, but here perhaps a little bit more clearly, right? So she's moving in, she's crossing the sort of lines of what was once a sort of rigorous sort of gendered exception. And in doing that, she's actually following the lead of a couple of really path-breaking women at Standing Rock, Edith Claymore and Nellie Two Bear Gates, who start making these fantastically beautiful beaded purses and valises and suitcases and things like that. So in some ways where Mary Sully decides she's actually going to do representational work, you can see that perhaps she's also in dialogue, right, with these native women who are doing these amazingly interesting and creative things on their own. So she's always functioning in a Dakota, in a kind of native, sometimes pan-Indian sort of context, though only a few times in terms of the actual subject matter. So here, she's framed the entire practice of Native Christianity as one that is dependent upon Native women, all of whom are depicted in traditional clothes, designs, patterns, hair, which in the end is going to return to a kind of beadwork, or quillwork rather, quillwork kind of pattern, right? Really the highest art, traditional art for plains women. So this is one of the three that she does that have really important Native themes. This other one, Bishop Hare, the Bishop of the Episcopal Church, she's set up this visual pun where he's functioning as a man. You can tell he's a man because like the bottom of that, but he's also functioning as a cross, but he's also functioning as a bird because he has these clip wings, right? He's traveling bird kind of, kind of character. So she's representing him in this kind of way, the punning art that she had, which was just so amazing. And with that, then we can perhaps come back to Indian history to think about the ways that she was connecting these plains traditions, this robust visual vocabulary, to current political kinds of challenges that are going on. So in the first panel, you can see this progression, this historical kind of progression from an idyllic world into the hardships of the reservation, the challenges of the modern world, and at the very top right, these feet crushing the aspirations of Native people, right? And they're kind of militaristic and they're kind of corporate and they got this kind of evil, sinister fog sort of, moving in and among them. So these are the things that she's going to work with then in the second panel to repurpose that. And wow, this is not anybody's wallpaper, right? I mean, this is a serious thing. And you can see what she's done. You've got the feet, you've got the modernist figures of anxiety, you've got the barbed wire of history, and then you've got this incredibly colorful kind of pattern in the colors of parfleche painting, right? These kind of rawhide painting. Well, she's taken red and sort of really made it quite robust by making it pink and making it purple, right? Sort of working off of those kind of red sorts of things. And then when you get to the bottom panel, you can see that she's taking all four of those little strips or bands and flipped them on their side. So the first panel, you can see the feet, the blue jeans. Then you can see the modernist figures of anxiety, now abstracted into brown. You can see the barbed wire of history, and then overriding all of that, right? The colors of the parfleche, right? The sort of color of robust native life and futurity, right? That's going on. And when you sort of think about that bottom panel and you go back and think about the ways that she cared so much about native material culture and was drawing upon it, here you can see when you blow this up, she's got all of these things happening, right? Rawhide, bows and arrows, cradle boards, headdresses, medallions, parfleche, even those little hair ties, right, that she had for Jane Withers. And so once you start to see these native elements, I think they start to appear everywhere. And just as a quick example, in that sort of bottom panel for Harry Emerson Fosdick, right, you can see the sort of box and line patterns, the doublings, the diamonds, the triangles, the rotational symmetry, all of these things. And at the same time that she's doing that, right, spotlights, Hollywood, and the bottom panel, it's kind of neo-Egyptian almost, right? She's got these deco things going on. She's got kind of Art Nouveau things going on. Hollywood celebrities, commercial design patterns, this music kind of thing, which is amazing. When you get to the bottom, it looks like an explicitly Art Deco kind of, kind of reference. And here you can see with Lupe Velez, this sort of beautiful overhead kind of shot, and then this really lovely sort of design pattern, her aspirations, right, to actually do things commercially. So it all adds up, I think, to this incredibly complex art, knitting together city and reservation, northern plains, pan-Indian sorts of aesthetic strategies, American modernism, adaptation and change over time with persistence, and that thing that the Anishinaabe literary critic Gerald Visner famously named survivance, which is to say not just survival and resistance, but actually a resistant and persistent practice of wit and humor and courage and storytelling, always framed by a kind of ironic meta-awareness, right, of the cultural dynamics of white desire and repulsion, a pragmatic kind of reverse ethnography of American society and culture, right? A cagey sort of tricksterish performance of post-Indianness, as Visner said, for anyone who was tempted and willing to watch what was going on there. So this has been the project of my career, which unfortunately means that anything new is going to mark the beginning of my decline. But it also seems likely to me that Mary Sully is poised to fulfill my greatest hope for this work, which is to make us rethink the canon of both Native American art and American art in general. This iteration of the show here, with its wonderful attention to the material culture of the Northern Plains and the woodlands, I think can only help advance that project, even as it invites us to ponder Mary Sully's work at length. And this is indeed what happens in the galleries. Audiences recognize that these works are puzzles of a sort, and you can spend a long time staring at one and trying to figure things out, oftentimes Googling the person right on your phone. They demand our attention and our interpretive skills in ways that tend to grab and hold people in place. I spent a fair bit of time just sort of when it was at the Met, kind of standing in the galleries watching people, and I saw people who spent 2 hours trying to puzzle out this art. That's how great it is, I think. So I am convinced that my two great aunts were geniuses in their own right. They were fascinating people who traveled the world together, leaving behind these amazing legacies. So I want to thank you for letting me share one of those legacies with you today. And I think we have time to take a couple of questions, and I think there are microphones on the side, and so if people have questions, we should speak them into the microphones as we're about to.
Hi, this was fabulous, for fabulous works. I've got two questions. The first deals with synesthesia and whether you think that she had it and is reflected in these works. And then the second is, who do you think she was trying to communicate with? Was it a publisher who might be out there? Was it a general public? Or was it a deeper conversation with herself?
These are two great questions. So in this synesthesia piece of this, I mean, one of the things I did in the book was I gathered up every moment where Ella wrote about her sister and sort of made a symptoms list, right? And I took it to my friends in the psychology department at the University of Michigan. I said, will you please give me a diagnosis? And they said, we don't do that. We don't do that. But I think there is good enough evidence to speculate that she may actually have had physiological phenomena we would call synesthesia. So I don't think this is out of the ballpark at all. How we would actually know that is less clear to me. think is a much stronger argument to say that in the art itself, she's absolutely making synesthetic moves, right? Color is always attached to music, notes, all of these things are always happening. Wherever you see color here, there's something emotional happening, there's something that's clicking, somewhere. The color is representing not just color, it's not just there for no good reason, it's there to represent something larger than itself. So she's in the tradition of, Arthur Dove and other kinds of, artists who are doing synesthetic work within the art itself. Right, so I think a yes to that one for sure, and a kind of maybe, with the other. In terms of who she was working with, I mean, I do think that some part of this art was therapeutic in a sense that, I mean, this is a lot of work when you think about it. She was carrying around some 600 pieces of paper that she was going to use. She would put them on a drawing board and she would just sit there and draw. Sometimes when you flip them over, you can see where she's made a kind of false start, where she's got these grids. Some of them, if you go in the gallery and look at, for example, Easter in a large city, there's a bilateral symmetry down the middle, and there's this whole set of faces, scores of faces. I want to say hundreds, but it's not hundreds, but it's scores of faces. Intricately. I mean, this must have taken forever. So, she was very socially reclusive. She tended not to want to socialize with people. She would stay up in her room. So I think this is in some ways has a certain kind of therapeutic quality in the sense that she's sort of speaking to herself. But I think it's also really clear that she had aspirations as an artist. She, I think, saw herself as an artist. This wasn't just sort of like doing crossword puzzles. In the book, I make this argument about a book by a woman named Dorothea Brand called Wake Up and Live, which says something like, don't just sit there and do crosswords, wake up and live, like do something, and I think she was seeing herself as doing a project that was actually important. And I think the clearest evidence for that is the ways in which Ella clearly saw it as a project of import for other people. So one of the reasons we can know a bit about this art is in 1938, Ella seems to have tried to put together what would have been a promo package. So one of the ways she did this was mounted these at schools and then got these letters of endorsement, right, from the principals and the superintendents. And she also put together a list of the works. And that lets us date at least a kind of earlier part and a later part. There's 24, I believe, that are sort of not on the list, and so they're later works. And you can really tell stylistically they're later kinds of works. So there is a moment where, I think she is thinking about these as possible designs. There's an early letter from Ella where she says, well, she hasn't sold anything yet. I think I actually have this in here, which implies, I think, that both of them thought these things might actually have some sort of commercial value to it. So I think both things are true, that it's an intimate and personal thing, but I think she also had a more expansive vision for the work.
Hi, I have a question about the portraits. And do you have an idea of why she chose the particular subjects that she did? I mean, what do you think was the reason that she was attracted to, for example, a baseball player? Or, I mean, popular culture was huge, right? So there was lots of places to go. Why that group of people?
Yes, I do not know. I mean, so often I wish I could just be in her head. We were talking about this earlier today about sort of like, what was she thinking? How would you get inside her head? I mean, it's really clear there's some thematic things, right? She cares a lot about music. She cares a lot about movies. And so you can see a certain kind of cluster that fit within those sorts of categories. I mean, I'm really struck by the fact that like there's plenty of conversations going on about modern art. She's not interested in that. The two sisters spend a lot of time talking about psychology. Well, she doesn't really do anything like that. There's no Freud, there's nothing like that. But she does do this guy, Carl Seashore, who invents sort of auditory tests for children. So much of it is quirky things. I mean, Alice Fazende, for example, was very hard to track down. She appears in the sort of written record twice. Both those little headers or footers at the bottom of kind of columns of the sort of magazines of the time, Saturday Evening Post or whatever, they have a quirky little fact at the bottom because we need to fill up the space. So sort of Alice Fazende turns 100, last Confederate widow, her, betrothed rode off and never came back and she never married, period, that's it. And then there's another one where when Alice Fazende dies, a couple of years later, that's it. So she must have been taken by little quirky things, right, that sort of somehow just kind of caught and captured her. many of which we can't really quite explain. So I think you can think about the large categories. Okay, she was interested in musicians. She was interested in film. This is one of the things that, I mean, if I'm going to choose one rationale, and I don't want to overstate this, many of the things that when you go and sort of dig deep into who the characters are, it's attached to a movie. You know. So, for example, she had one called Greed. I was standing when this was at the Met show, and I was standing there with my friend Carlo Rotello, who knows everything, and he says, "Oh, like the Frank Norris novel." And I was like, "Oh my God, I missed that. I missed the Frank Norris novel." And he said, "Oh yeah, the Erich von Stroheim film from 1924." And we Google it, and sure enough, it's like the film poster has been transformed here. So movies is one kind of really useful way, I think, of kind of trying to situate, some of these folks. It doesn't work in every case. It works in a number of cases.
My question is just more about that modeled box and suitcase. So when you had all these, were they just stacked up, like just on top of each other? And were there any directions about how to display them? Were you just going by these installations she had done before when she had arranged them in the triptych? Or were there directions left and which way to orient some of them?
Well, so the good news, the thing that she did for us when they had these showings is she taped them together. So it's bad news for the conservators, but it's good news for us. So she flipped them over and she used kind of a gummed tape and she reinforced all the sides. And then she taped the three panels together, leaving a tiny little gap, which is about what you can see when you see the conservation and how they're mounted. Almost all of them stayed taped together. And many of them have labels, which she has in her own little lovely font. So you can see the name, you can see how they're arranged, you can see how they were articulated, you can see, how she wanted them to be together. There's a few where there's no title and there's no nothing. There's some where she's kind of scrawled something in handwriting. There's a few that are very confusing where she'll write on the back of something that says Dizzy Dean, she'll put John Dewey. So whether she's just note to myself, I don't know. It's curious. But because of that, we can see exactly what the form is, how she intended them to go. So, but she left almost no writing behind. The writing that she left behind mostly was to the Episcopal bishop, and mostly in the 1920s when she was in some financial trouble and she was needing some money. Almost every instance, Ella is writing on her behalf. Yeah, there's really very little in terms of written record.
Philip, my name is Thomas Kane. I'm from Panema, Minnesota, Red Lake Nation. I had the opportunity to film your father at his house in Golden, Colorado in 2005. And he talks in the film about the sacred sites in the Black Hills. And there's something really comical at one part where your father talks about meals. As soon as he talks about meals, Bob starts barking. His dog.
Our dog.
So wanting to share that with you. I don't know if you saw the film yet, but Rick Williams had brought me to his house to do that film because he couldn't go to the Black Hills at that time. So I had been showing the film at universities, when they talk about teaching out of his books. So they would bring me in at the end of the class and show the film. But I thought it was really interesting to see your last name, Deloria. There's a D and a L in there. Were they speaking both with a D and a L? Is how they came up with the last name?
No, I mean, the last name was French. I mean, François Deloria was sort of this French guy. We don't exactly know. There's one theory that he came up the Missouri, that he shows up in the census at Fort Vincennes in 1785 and came up the Missouri. There's another theory that he was a school teacher in St. Louis. There's lots of sort of family stories about, my uncle will remember this, like the island that we inherited in France, right? These kinds of, right? Two young boys fleeing the Huguenots. Right? So there's Delorier's, in upstate New York and upper Michigan, right? There's anywhere the French fur trade was, you can find folks with that particular kind of name. I mean, what's really interesting to me is the other name that my great was called Sasue, right? Which, I thought was sort of idiosyncratic, but then I started seeing other Sassues, right? And I think it's, Dakota people pronouncing François Deloria, Sasue, I mean, I think it's, so, and he had other names that he went by, Chechehina, Harry Thai, other kinds of names like that. But I think that the D and the L is the French.
And I have one more question about the artwork. Was there any star quilts made out of any of this artwork?
No, but I think there's a number of images here where she's clearly drawing on quilting design patterns, right? So she's got that kind of elongated diamond, right? That's so characteristic of quilting, and patterns that are sort of star-like. What's really interesting in terms of the star sort of form, she always, with one exception, as far as I can tell, uses a 6-point star rather than a 5-point star. And I'm not quite sure what that's about, other than sort of two triangles working together, kind of things. But it's pretty clear that there's some kind of quilting resonances going on, and that, I think, is totally to be expected as someone who grew up sort of thinking about women's art circles.
Thank you, miigwech.
Hello, I'm Deanna Stans from Wagner, South Dakota, Yankton Sioux. And I do know where your aunt and your other aunt, Ella, are buried. And one thing that I'd like to comment on, of course, then is the church slides. And do you have any more information about that? Because it looked like the outline of what is called the Niobrara Cross. And I don't know how much people know about the mission of the Episcopal Church, especially in the Dakotas. And it all came about from 1862, where Samuel Hinman went with the Dakota people down different places, but starting out from Fort Snelling, and then traveled with them up to Crow Creek in the middle of South Dakota. And then eventually when the Santee Reservation was formed, then he was there and helped create that mission there. Then what was reminiscent in Mary's work was Bishop Hare. So Zitkana, well, I don't know which dialect now, I can't remember, but Swiftbird is what it translates to. And it showed his supposedly shadow going across a circle of teepees. And I was thinking, was she trying to depict what is called a Niobrara convocation? And a Niobrara convocation, I don't know the beginning date, but when we hosted that Niobrara convocation in 2019, it was the 147th convocation. And so people had been meeting, the Mission Church people, mainly Dakota people, had been meeting for over 147 times consecutively, unless it was, for instance, I forget what stopped them from meeting. I think it was in 1918 or something, maybe the flu. So anyway, I thought I would share that with everybody, since you didn't really speak up about that, but I thought maybe you knew about it.
Yeah, well, thank you for, I mean, this is exactly right. I mean, in the book, I spend probably too many pages on that image, because it is the Niobrara Cross. It's painted, it's white, and the Niobrara Cross has these sort of 3 sort of bulbs on the end of each part of the cross. And I mean, if we were to dig into that image, a bit more, it's a visual pun, right? So it's this sort of, it looks like the flaps of a teepee. These Native women are moving in there, and when they go in the teepee, they split and they go to either side, right? And they go out at the end, and there's a yellow light and a rainbow, right, at the far end, right? But at the same time, I think there's an ambivalence in here, right? At the same time, kind of about halfway through the teepee, they all become kind of shadowed. By the time you get to the end, they're silhouettes, right? And it's like, so I don't know quite what to make of that. But this is the sort of vision of Sasue, right? In which he entered sort of this, he's following these birds, and he enters this teepee, and he's confronted with these two choices. He has to go along the edge of the teepee. On one side, there's sweat lodges. On the other side, there's skeletons. And he comes out at the end, and he's made a decision, right, about his life. And so in a lot of ways, that top panel is a family panel, I think, is representing this vision, even as it represents the church. And, you know, so the flaps of the teepee and the thing that's hanging down is the purple robes, right? You know, priest, bishop, blue vestment on, no head, I will note, right? You know, but this is the protective sort of arms, and then the Niobrara cross, you know, right there, sort of signifying that church. When you move to the second panel, actually, I should not just talk about this, we should see, maybe go back and see if we can find it really quick. It's coming. Pretty sure it's coming pretty soon. Yeah. So you can see, right, moving into the teepee, spreading around the side, the sort of the robe, which becomes a teepee with these teepee flaps, right, the visual pun, the Niobrara cross, right, all these things going on. So my great-great son, right, was Tipi Sapa, and this comes out of this sort of vision. And if you sort of think that that top panel is reflecting this lodge, right, then when you look at the second panel, what you can see is like this black triangle, right, inverted, upside down, right, Tipi Sapa, the black lodge, right. So I think there's this sort of gesture. And what's inside the black lodge is the three sort of, you know, the bolts of the Niobrara cross right now transposed into this thing. So I think there's something really quite deep and quite familial going on in this image. So when we think about who's she doing this for, this feels to me like it's got a lot of kind of communicative power, not only to herself, but to people in the family. And then, you know, what's interesting is she'll take some of these textile designs. You can see that kind of floral down at the bottom with blue, and then she converts these things into these kind of hanging blanket designs. But that black lodge, I think, is just so dominant in the second, you know, in the second panel. So I think she's engaged with all these kinds of issues, you know, as you were mentioning. And then just to go forward, right, I mean, the circle of the convocation. And it's, again, I think, you know, this is, there's a little bit of an ambivalence, you know, to me here. I mean, this is clearly the sort of three-form representation happening, but it's also this kind of looming shadow, right? There's a kind of a thing that's happening. How is it that this figure, right? Is it that the figure of Bishop Hare sits at the center of the circle? I mean, that may be it. It's not entirely clear to me sort of how to, you know, how to read that. Although I think if you look at the middle panel, you can see like the ways in which, right, the cross becomes both a Dakota cross, right, without the extended arms, but also a church cross, you know, and then we've got the camp kind of being kind of reformed again. So, but this is the joy of these images, right, is the more you look at them, the more things you see, and the more you are led to think and to puzzle and to you know, kind of contemplate. And that's, I think, what good art ought to do. There you go.
Just explain what the Niobrara Cross was, because most of these people don't know what it was.
So the Niobrara Missionary District, right, coming out of Samuel Hinman and, you know, and others, was the Episcopal missionary district that covered sort of northern Nebraska, parts of and the Dakotas. It had its own bishop. Bishop Hare was the bishop, and then later Bishop Burleson, Bishop Roberts. These were the bishops that my two great aunts were constantly in communication with, sort of leveraging the church, relying on the church, you know, a lot. At this point, the Episcopal Church was willing to invest in native clergy. So my great-great-grandfather, Philip J. Deloria, was a native Episcopal clergyman. My grandfather, Vine Deloria Sr., was a native Episcopal clergyman. There were lots of native Episcopal clergymen, you know, kind of there. It's not until the sort of 40s and 50s that the church sort of moves a little bit away from that, but it's a very robust kind of native Christian culture that happens there in the Niobrara Missionary District. And this cross is a very important signifier, right, of a kind of Dakota sort of Christianity that really structured many, many people's lives. Well, it's 3:15. I think we've sort of reached the. I think we've sort of reached the end. I want to thank you all so much, and I hope that you can get to galleries and enjoy them.